Hours of failure had already broken the confidence of seasoned engineers, yet all it took was one sentence from an outsider to turn doubt into disbelief. No polished degree or shining uniform accompanied that voice, only conviction that refused to be silenced. What followed was not just a repair, but the beginning of a truth that would unravel prejudice and awaken a legacy hidden in plain sight. Make sure to subscribe, hit like, and tell us in the comments what part of the world you are joining from. Inside the cavernous hangar of Atlanta International Airport, the fluorescent lights hummed above as the smell of jet fuel lingered in the air, mixing with the sweat of exhausted men who had been working far too long on a machine that refused to yield. A Bombardier jet, sleek and white, sat idle on the tarmac outside, its owner, billionaire Richard Coleman, watching from within the hangar as his engineers circled the lifeless heart of his aircraft, a gleaming silver engine resting on a wheeled stand. Richard, tall and commanding in his Navy suit, was not a man who tolerated inefficiency, and every tick of the wall clock felt like a hammer striking at the patience he had built his empire on. For 6 hours, Mark Stevens, the head engineer, had guided his team through diagnostics, checks, recalibrations, and component inspections. Yet the machine remained defiant, silent, and mocking. Their pride as white engineers with years of schooling and experience was crumbling in front of the billionaire whose presence only deepened their shame. Mark muttered under his breath, "We've tried everything. It doesn't add up." His men grumbled, shoulders slumping, tools clattering back into carts with frustration. The guards at the doors exchanged wary glances, sensing the billionaire's irritation building with each wasted minute. And then, from the doorway, a voice rose soft but unshaken, unexpected, yet piercing. "If you permit, I will fix it." Heads turned sharply, eyes narrowing as they landed on the figure framed by sunlight. A young black woman stood there, her gown torn and dirt-stained, hanging loosely on her thin frame. Hunger was carved into her bones, her hair wild and unkempt, but her eyes dark, steady, alive with a strange light did not flicker. They were not fixed on the guards or the billionaire, but on the engine itself. Her hands, smudged with grease despite her appearance, clutched at her sides as though holding back a truth only she could see. Laughter erupted, harsh and mocking, from the cluster of engineers. Mark sneered, shaking his head in disbelief. "Are you kidding? We've been at this for hours, and you think you can walk in and fix it?" One of the younger men scoffed. "Security, get her out of here. This is no place for charity cases." The two guards moved quickly, boots striking against the polished floor, intent on removing the intruder. But before they could, Richard lifted his hand, his calm, commanding voice cutting through the derision like a knife. "Stop." The room froze. The guards halted mid-step. The laughter died awkwardly in the engineers' throats. Richard's eyes stayed on the girl, studying her not with contempt but with the curiosity of a man who had seen fortunes appear from the most unlikely places. "In my line of business," he said, voice measured, "I have seen unusual things. Let the young lady speak." A ripple of disbelief passed through the men, but no one dared contradict him. The girl stepped forward, her shoes scraping against the floor. Her voice, quiet but unwavering, carried through the silence. "Sir, I heard your men describe the problem. You said the engine made a whistle during landing, and afterward it ran rough and wouldn't spool properly after shutdown. May I look?" Shock flickered across Mark's face. How could she know the exact symptoms? He had whispered them to his team, not shouted them across the hangar. His jaw clenched as he struggled for words, but Richard's gaze never wavered. The billionaire recognized something rare in the way she spoke: clarity, precision, and above all, conviction. After a long pause, he nodded once. "Give her the gloves." Gasps echoed through the hangar. Naomi stood before the lifeless jet engine, her gloved hands trembling for only a moment before finding their stillness again, her thin frame framed by fluorescent light and hostile stares. Yet her focus did not waver from the machine that seemed to call to her in a language the others had forgotten how to hear, and the silence that followed Richard Coleman's order weighed heavily over every man present, pressing on pride, ego, and doubt alike. Mark Stevens broke first, his tone sharp, laced with mockery meant to protect his pride more than the truth. "Do you even know what you're looking at? This isn't some car engine you fiddled with on the street. This is a Rolls-Royce turbofan, the kind of machine that takes years of training to even understand." His men snickered, the sound brittle and forced, their laughter more armor than amusement, because deep down the precision with which Naomi had described the symptoms still gnawed at them, and none could explain how she knew. Naomi did not turn her eyes toward them, her voice steady though soft. "I know what I heard, and I know engines do not lie. If you permit, I will show you." Mark stepped forward, his broad shoulders blocking her view, his face tight with disdain. "You don't belong here. You don't belong anywhere near this machine. We've got degrees, certifications, decades of experience. You have rags on your back." The words hung sharp, meant to slice, and one of the younger engineers muttered, "She's wasting our time." The guards shifted uncomfortably, caught between duty to protect the hangar and the billionaire's command not to interfere, their eyes darting to Richard for guidance, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on Naomi, studying her as if every second was a test she did not yet realize she was taking. Naomi lifted her chin, her dark eyes finally meeting Mark's, her tone calm but carrying an edge of defiance. If experience is measured only by paper and not by truth, then perhaps that is why the engine still sits silent after 6 hours. A murmur rippled through the team, some scoffing, others glancing at Mark with unease, for her words had struck at the very core of their failure, and Richard's lips curved ever so slightly, not in amusement, but in recognition of courage. Mark's face reddened, pride stung by the audacity of a girl he believed beneath him, and he barked, "Fine, touch it. Let's see how long it takes before you break something. But when you fail, remember who gave you the chance." Naomi nodded once, not as one intimidated, but as one sealing a quiet promise to herself, and stepped closer to the engine. She placed her gloved hand lightly along the intake rim, feeling the cold steel beneath her palm, tilting her head as though listening to something the others could not. She crouched, eyes scanning, fingers trailing along the sensor harness, her movements precise, unhurried, filled with the kind of focus that turned mockery into silence. Richard's eyes never left her, the faintest tension visible in his jaw, for though he had defended her presence, even he did not know yet whether she was miracle or mistake. The engineers whispered among themselves, one muttering, "She's pretending, just making a show of it," another hissing back, "But what if she finds something? What if?" Before the thought trailed off, swallowed by pride. Naomi leaned closer to a small access panel near the compressor section, tapping it gently with her knuckles, listening, then reaching for a flashlight that lay on the cart. Without asking, she lifted it, angling the beam inside, then took up a mirror, holding it carefully into the space. Her breath slowed as she peered deeper. "There," she said softly, her finger pointing toward a clamp. "That clamp is tight, but on the wrong groove, leaving just enough of a gap to bleed air. That's your whistle under load." Mark scoffed loudly. "Any fool could claim that." "It's not that simple." Naomi ignored him, her eyes moving along a sensor wire, her voice steady as she traced it with her finger. "And here, insulation cracked, rubbing against the bracket. When it heats, the reading goes wrong. The system misinterprets it, tries to compensate, and the engine feels sick." The hangar fell into stunned silence. Mark's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. One of his engineers whispered hoarsely, That could explain it." Naomi pulled back slightly, looking over her shoulder at Richard, her expression neither boastful nor uncertain. "Both faults hide each other. If you fix only one, the other makes the engine fail again. Together, they trap you." Richard stepped forward slowly, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, his eyes locked on Naomi's face. "Can you fix it?" Naomi's gaze met his, unblinking, her voice clear. "If you permit." The words echoed like a vow, her tone the same as when she first entered, and for a heartbeat the hangar seemed to hold its breath. Richard gave a single nod, his command sharp, "Do it." The atmosphere in the hangar shifted instantly, doubt giving way to reluctant curiosity, and though Mark muttered under his breath, he stepped aside, defeated by Richard's will. Naomi moved to the cart, selecting tools with steady hands, her movements quick but precise, as if memory rather than sight guided her. She loosened the misaligned clamp, reset it into the proper groove, tightened it with a firm click that echoed across the room. She trimmed and rewrapped the damaged sensor wire, slid a sleeve over it, and tied it neatly away from the bracket, ensuring it would never rub again. Richard Coleman's posture was steady, arms folded across his chest, his gaze unflinching as he tracked her every move, silently weighing each second as if he were back in a boardroom deciding whether to sign a billion-dollar contract. Naomi inhaled slowly, letting the familiar smell of metal and fuel settle her nerves, then lowered her hand to trace the smooth edge of the intake, her touch light, her ears straining as if the machine itself might whisper secrets. She crouched, her hair falling into her face, and with her fingers she followed the sensor harness, eyes narrowing at a subtle inconsistency that others had overlooked in their haste. She spoke quietly but firmly, her words carrying through the silence. "Here, the harness alignment is off, tension too tight where it should give. The vibration under load makes it sing like a whistle." The engineers exchanged startled glances, Mark Stevens scoffing loudly to mask his unease, but even he felt the sting of her precision, for her description matched exactly what he had heard, yet failed to trace. Naomi did not pause for his protest. She shifted to the small panel near the compressor, loosening a latch, lifting it carefully, and angling the mirror inside, her voice calm, though her heart pounded. There, the clamp sits firm, but not on the right groove. That creates the gap you could not see, the leak you could not hear except under strain. And when the air escapes, it plays against the casing like a whistle. One of the younger engineers muttered under his breath, "She's guessing," but his voice lacked conviction, because the detail in her tone sounded less like a guess and more like a verdict. Naomi's hand moved next to a wire that twisted awkwardly near a bracket, the insulation scarred where metal had bitten slowly with every vibration. "And here," she continued, her eyes narrowing, "the insulation has cracked, the wire rubs against steel. When heat rises, the reading fails. The system believes the engine is unstable, and it tries to correct a lie. The machine stumbles, not because its heart is broken, but because it has been told it is sick." Silence stretched long enough for even Richard to feel the weight of it press against his chest. And then Mark broke with a scoff that sounded weaker than he intended. "Coincidences? Nothing more." She strings words together to impress. But his own second-in-command whispered, almost against his will, "It fits. Both faults would hide each other. You'd chase one and miss the other every time." Naomi looked up from her crouch, her dark eyes meeting Richard's with quiet certainty. "Fix one without the other, and the machine still fails. But repair them together, and the song stops. The system breathes again." Richard stepped forward, the light glinting from his cufflinks as he asked, "Can you correct it?" Naomi's chest tightened with the gravity of his question, yet she forced her voice to remain even. "If you permit." The echo of her first words resonated through the hangar, and for a moment the memory of her standing ragged in the doorway merged with the image of her poised now before the crippled engine, her gloved hands steady, her voice sure. Richard studied her for a long second, the silence stretching, before he gave a single nod, his tone final. "Do it." Mark's face reddened as his authority dissolved under Richard's command, but he did not move to stop her. Instead, he turned away, muttering curses only half audible, knowing resistance would brand him small before the man who paid his salary. Naomi bent to the tool cart, selecting a wrench with practiced fingers, and though she had no badge, no title, no contract, the way she handled the tools made every mechanic in the room feel as if they were watching one of their own. She loosened the clamp with careful precision, realigned it onto the correct groove, tightened until the click sounded clean and sharp, then trimmed the damaged wire, stripped and rewrapped the insulation, and slid a protective sleeve over it, tying it neatly away from the bracket. Each motion was efficient, deliberate, repeated not once but 3 times in checking, as if to assure the machine itself that its song of pain was finally heard. Sweat ran along her temple, her thin frame trembling only slightly from exertion, but her eyes remained locked in concentration, her lips moving silently as though reciting equations learned long ago in classrooms, where her brilliance once shone before life's tragedies cast her into shadows. The engineers who had laughed stood silent now, their arms crossed tighter than before, their jaws set, but in their silence was the grudging awareness that every movement she made carried knowledge, not chance. Richard watched, and in his chest something long dormant stirred, not hope for his flight alone, but for the possibility that greatness sometimes arrived clothed not in silk and wealth, but in rags and hunger. Naomi finished, wiping her gloved hands across the cloth, then removed them carefully, placing them back on the cart with respect as though tools themselves deserved honor. She straightened, her voice carrying evenly across the room. "It is ready. Mark scoffed again, but softer this time, his pride struggling against evidence, and Richard raised a hand to silence him before the protest fully formed. "Prepare the test," he ordered, and the engineers moved quickly, pushing the wheeled stand toward the tarmac, attaching cables, connecting the ground cart, setting safety cones. Their words came short and clipped, not to Naomi but to each other, and though resentment still colored their movements, something else lingered beneath it, an edge of respect they could not yet name. Naomi stood back, her hands clasped before her, watching with quiet intensity, her heart pounding not with fear of failure, but with the knowledge that this moment could decide if the door that had been closed on her life would ever open again. Richard stepped closer to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You spoke like someone who has heard this machine in ways my men could not. Who are you really?" Naomi's lips parted, then closed again, her eyes glistening but steady. "If the test succeeds," she said softly, "I will tell you my name." Richard studied her face, his sharp eyes seeing the pain behind her calm, and gave a slow nod. "Fair enough." The wheeled stand carrying the massive engine rolled slowly out toward the edge of the tarmac, its polished steel glinting beneath the afternoon sun, and the men who had spent 6 fruitless hours laboring on it moved quickly now with clipped voices and careful steps, as if the atmosphere itself warned them they were no longer in full control of what was about to happen, because all eyes had shifted toward the homeless black woman who had dared to enter their sacred circle of expertise and place her hands where their experience had failed. And though some still clenched their jaws with resentment, even they knew something fundamental had changed in the silence that followed her announcement that the machine was ready. Naomi walked just behind them, her hands clasped in front of her, her heart pounding in rhythm with the clatter of cables and the rattle of clamps being secured, yet her gaze never left the engine, and the wind tugged at her tattered gown as if to remind her of the world she had come from, the streets she had survived, the hunger that had been her only companion until this moment, and still she stood taller than she had in years, because for the first time in 2 long years she was not invisible. Richard Coleman oversaw the preparations personally, his navy suit a sharp silhouette against the glaring sun, his shoes clicking against the concrete as he walked to the control cart where instruments glowed and wires connected to the test panel. And though his demeanor was calm, his eyes betrayed a flicker of tension, because while he had placed faith in this young woman, he knew that billions of dollars in contracts, the reputation of his jet, and even his personal safety depended on what was about to unfold. Yet his instincts told him not to look away, not to retreat into doubt, because greatness often arrived uninvited, cloaked in disguise. Mark Stevens stood to the side, arms crossed, his face a storm of anger and humiliation, and though he muttered under his breath that the test would expose her ignorance, his stomach twisted with the sickening awareness that she might actually succeed where he had failed, and if she did, the respect he had commanded for years among his men would never fully return. Naomi inhaled deeply, the smell of fuel heavy in her lungs, and lifted her chin as Richard glanced toward her one last time before resting his hand on the starter switch, his voice carrying over the wind. "Everyone clear." The mechanics scattered into their safe positions, cones were checked, lines secured, and the beacon atop the stand began to spin, its red light flashing across the silver wing of the bombardier waiting nearby. Naomi's pulse quickened, but she clenched her fists at her sides and whispered to herself words no one else could hear. "Listen, breathe, hold." Richard pressed the button, and the machine that had mocked them all leapt suddenly to life with a low whine that rose and rose, the turbine blades beginning to spin faster, numbers climbing across the monitor, the whine deepening into a growl, and for a moment a surge of hope rippled through the hangar. But then, sharp and cruel, a warning alarm chirped and a red light blinked on the panel. Gasps broke from the engineers, Mark shouting, "Shut it down before you destroy the core." The sound wavered, the engine caught between rising power and choking death, and every face turned toward Naomi as if demanding she admit defeat, but instead she stepped forward, her hand raised, her voice cutting through panic with authority that silenced them all. "Do not stop it, not yet. Listen, it is not the core, it is the sensor recalibrating after my repair." The engineers stared, disbelief mingling with fear, but Richard's sharp eyes locked on hers, and in that moment he recognized the absolute certainty in her tone, the same certainty that had once persuaded entire boards to follow him into impossible ventures, and his voice, calm but commanding, cut across the chaos, "Hold it steady. The turbine whined. The numbers on the screen flickered. The red light glared defiantly. And then, like a heart finding its rhythm, the sound smoothed into a steady rush. The warning light blinked once, twice, and finally turned green, bathing the panel in a glow that felt like triumph itself. A collective gasp surged across the men, one engineer dropping his wrench, another whispering impossible under his breath, and even Mark staggered back, his face pale as the realization crushed him that she had been right. The engine's roar steadied into perfection, a hum so smooth it vibrated through the concrete floor like the heartbeat of power reborn, and in that instant Richard's lips parted in astonishment, his breath catching in disbelief that in less than 20 minutes this homeless black woman had accomplished what his entire team of seasoned white engineers could not do in 6 grueling hours. Naomi exhaled slowly, her eyes glistening with sweat and tears, her arms hanging loose at her sides, her voice barely above a whisper. "It breathes again." Richard turned to her, his expression transformed from suspicion to something close to reverence, and he stepped closer, lowering his tone, though the entire hangar seemed to echo his words. "What is your name?" Naomi's chest tightened, her voice trembling yet strong. "My name is Naomi Johnson." The name, ordinary to some, struck Mark like a blow, his memory flashing back to stories whispered in academic circles. Johnson, from Georgia Tech, top of your class, then vanished, his words tumbling out in shock, and murmurs rippled through the engineers as recognition spread that this was not some beggar but a prodigy whose name had once been spoken with awe before tragedy had erased her from their world. Naomi blinked back tears, her lips quivering as she forced herself to explain, her voice raw. 2 years ago, my father took another wife. My mother poisoned him and then herself. I was their only child. I was about to begin my career, but when they both died in front of me, I broke. I could not face life. I left everything, wandered until I had nothing. I became no one. The silence that followed was heavy, some engineers lowering their heads in shame for their earlier laughter, and even Mark, whose pride still burned, could not meet her eyes. Richard, however, did not look away. His throat tightened, his chest heavy, and for the first time in years he felt tears threaten as he stepped closer, placing his hand gently on her shoulder, his voice firm but trembling. "You did not just fix my engine. You reminded me why second chances matter." The men stood silent, chastened, humbled, as Richard's voice grew stronger, carrying across the hangar. The engine continued to roar with perfect strength, the hum of its turbine smooth and unbroken, filling the hangar with a sound that only hours earlier had felt impossible, and every man who had mocked, doubted, or sneered at Naomi Johnson stood frozen, their faces pale, their pride stripped bare by the undeniable truth that the homeless black woman in rags had accomplished in minutes what they could not achieve in hours, and the air felt charged as though the very walls of the hangar knew something monumental had occurred. Richard Coleman, still standing near the control cart, lowered his hand from the switch, his sharp eyes never leaving Naomi as if to anchor himself to the reality of what she had just done. His voice carrying across the hangar in a tone softer than the command he was known for, but no less powerful, "What is your name?" Naomi hesitated, her throat tightening, her chest rising and falling with the weight of a moment she had not prepared for. And though she had carried her knowledge and skill like a hidden flame through years of hunger and despair, speaking her name now felt like stepping into light that could burn, but she drew a steadying breath and said clearly, "My name is Naomi Johnson." The name fell into the silence like a stone dropped into still water, and ripples of shock spread instantly through the gathered engineers, some frowning in confusion, others whispering under their breath. But it was Mark Stevens whose reaction cut through them all, his jaw slack, his voice hollow. "Johnson, from Georgia Tech, top of your class, the one they said would change aerospace engineering, then vanished." Murmurs rose quickly, stories half-remembered and rumors long whispered rushing back into focus. The legend of the prodigy who had dazzled professors with her brilliance, who had been promised a career with Aerotech International, who had disappeared 2 years ago without explanation, leaving only unanswered questions and the silence of potential gone cold. Naomi's eyes burned with unshed tears, her hands clenching at her sides as she forced herself to stand straight, her voice trembling but unbroken. "Yes, I was that Naomi. I was supposed to begin my life. But life ended before it could start." She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping briefly to the floor as memory stabbed at her heart, then lifted again, her words spilling raw and unpolished. 2 years ago, my father told us he would take another wife, and my mother could not bear the betrayal. She poisoned him, and then she ate the same food, saying they would die together rather than let him live for someone else. They died in front of me. They were my only family. I was 20 years old, just out of school, with interviews waiting for me, with the world expecting something of me, but when they both collapsed, I collapsed too. I could not face anyone. I could not face myself. I canceled everything. I threw away my phone. I walked away from the life I had, and I wandered until I lost myself completely. I became invisible. I became what you saw walk through that door today, a girl in rags with nothing left. The silence in the hangar was heavy, every engineer suddenly aware of the cruelty of their laughter, the smallness of their scorn compared to the weight of the tragedy Naomi carried. And even Mark, whose pride had resisted every truth until now, lowered his head, shame darkening his face as he remembered the way he had mocked her. Richard stepped forward slowly, his shoes clicking against the concrete floor, his gaze locked on Naomi, his own throat thick with something unfamiliar, because though he had spent his life in boardrooms where weakness was despised, here was a young woman who had bared her wounds in front of strangers, yet stood taller than any of them. He stopped before her, his voice low enough to feel personal, though the entire hangar heard it. "You did not just fix my engine, Naomi. You reminded me why second chances matter." Naomi's lips quivered as she blinked rapidly against the sting of tears, her body trembling as if the release of her secret had drained her strength. Yet she held herself upright, unwilling to bow under the weight of pity, because though her past was soaked in tragedy, this moment belonged not to her sorrow, but to her strength. Richard turned then, his voice booming now with the command of a man used to being obeyed, his words ringing against the steel walls. "All of you, remember this moment. Greatness is not in appearance, not in title, not in wealth, but in truth, in skill, in heart, and today Naomi Johnson has shown all three." Gasps and murmurs spread, some engineers shifting uncomfortably, others bowing their heads, and though pride burned still in some, the respect that had been absent only hours earlier now filled the space with undeniable weight. Naomi, overwhelmed, lifted her hands to her face, covering her mouth as tears finally spilled freely, and the sound of the engine behind her roared on like a living witness to her vindication. Richard placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his grip steady, reassuring as he spoke directly to her once more. "From this moment forward, you will never beg for food again. You will never walk these streets homeless again, for the world will know your name." The roar of the engine continued to pulse through the hangar like a living anthem, steady and strong, a sound that no longer belonged to steel and turbine alone, but to the courage of a young black woman who had refused to let her knowledge die with her past. And as the applause of the engineers swelled then fell into silence again, Richard Coleman stood firm beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his gaze sharp yet softened by the weight of everything she had just confessed. And in his mind a decision had already formed, not born of impulse, but of the clarity that sometimes comes only when truth slices through doubt. He looked around at the men who had failed for hours and at the woman who had succeeded in minutes, and his voice cut across the room with finality. "From this moment on, Naomi Johnson will not walk these streets hungry. She will not wander invisible. She will not be treated as less. She has proven herself today in a way none of you could, and I will make certain the world knows her name." His declaration echoed against steel and concrete, and though Mark Stevens clenched his jaw, humiliation raw in his chest, even he could not summon a retort because the evidence roared behind them with perfect strength, undeniable in its hum. Naomi's tears had not yet dried, her hands trembling slightly, but she drew herself straighter, her voice quiet but firm. "Sir, I did not come here expecting this. I only wanted one chance to remember who I was, to prove to myself that the fire inside me had not gone out." Richard turned toward her fully, his expression softening, his eyes catching the sheen of the overhead lights. "Naomi, you have done more than prove. You have reminded me that skill is not confined by titles or by suits or by the comfort of wealth. You reminded me that genius often hides where the world refuses to look. And for that, I will not leave you where I found you." He paused, drawing breath. his voice deepening as he delivered words that would change the course of her life. "I am flying to New York tonight to meet with executives of Aerotech International. The very company that once sought you before tragedy stole you from them. I will not attend that meeting without you. You will sit with me. You will be introduced not as a beggar, but as the woman who saved my jet when all others failed. And they will hear your voice, and they will know your worth." Gasps rippled through the remaining engineers, shock plain on their faces, and Mark muttered bitterly under his breath, "She doesn't belong in those rooms." But Richard snapped his head toward him, his eyes narrowing with icy authority. "She belongs wherever her knowledge carries her, and today it carried her further than you." Naomi's breath caught, her eyes wide, her heart pounding with a rhythm that felt unreal. "Sir, I have no clothes, no papers, nothing but what you see before you. How can I walk into such a place?" Richard's lips curved into something between a smile and a challenge. "You walked into this hangar in rags, and you commanded a machine that defeated men with 20 years of training. Do you think fabric defines you more than that? Still, if it eases your heart, I will see to everything. Clothes, documents, introductions. You will not be turned away again." Naomi felt her knees weaken as though the floor had shifted, and memories of nights sleeping under bridges, mornings begging for scraps, afternoons wandering past fences where she could glimpse the hangar she now stood inside, all flooded her at once, and she whispered through trembling lips, "Why would you do this for me?" Richard straightened, his voice carrying both steel and compassion. "Because you earned it. And because I have learned in my life that when someone proves themselves before your very eyes, you do not turn away. You honor it, or you betray yourself." The engineers behind them remained silent, some still nursing their wounded pride, others quietly nodding as though conceding that they had witnessed something history itself might remember, and Naomi, overwhelmed, pressed her hand against her chest, trying to steady the storm of emotions that threatened to undo her. Richard gestured toward the gleaming jet outside, its polished fuselage reflecting the sun like a promise. "That aircraft is leaving for New York in less than 6 hours, and it will not leave without you on board." Naomi's breath quickened, her mind racing, the words feeling like a dream too fragile to trust. And yet when she looked into Richard's face, she saw not pity but conviction, not charity but recognition. And it steadied her enough to whisper, "If you permit, I will go." Richard inclined his head, satisfied. "Then it is decided. Tonight you fly not as a shadow of who you were, but as the woman you were always meant to be." The guards at the doors, who had nearly dragged her out not an hour earlier, now looked at her with something between awe and regret. And even Mark, whose resentment still burned, turned his eyes away, unable to face the reality that the girl he had mocked was now stepping into a destiny far larger than his own. Naomi stood quietly, the engines hum behind her like the heartbeat of a friend, and she realized that for the first time since her parents' death, she felt something she thought had died forever: hope. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply, then opened them again with renewed clarity, and though fear lingered, it no longer chained her. Richard placed a hand lightly on her back, guiding her toward the jet, his voice quiet but steady. "Get ready, Naomi Johnson. The world is about to know your name." The night flight from Atlanta to New York passed like a dream Naomi feared she might wake from at any moment, the jet's cabin glowing with golden light as she sat stiffly near the window, her tattered gown a stark contrast against the cream leather seats, her heart pounding with every vibration of the aircraft she herself had saved, and across from her sat Richard Coleman, his posture relaxed but his eyes never leaving her, as though he were studying her with the same attention he gave to billion-dollar contracts. And though he spoke few words, his presence felt like a shield. When dawn painted the New York skyline pale orange, Naomi's stomach twisted, her hands clammy, because while she had survived humiliation, hunger, and grief, this test felt sharper, more dangerous, for in Atlanta she had proven herself to machines, but now she would stand before powerful men and women who saw only rags and skin, and her worth would be measured not just in truth, but against prejudice embedded in marble halls. A black car carried them through the bustling city, skyscrapers rising like glass giants around her, and Naomi stared at her reflection in the tinted window, her heart whispering questions she could not silence. What if they laugh? What if they turn me away? What if all of this vanishes? Richard noticed her tension, leaning slightly toward her, his voice calm yet commanding. "Remember, Naomi, machines do not care about appearances. only truth, and the people you meet today will try to reduce you to what they see, but you will show them what they cannot deny. His words steadied her just enough that by the time they entered the towering headquarters of Aerotech International, she could force her steps to remain firm, her chin lifted though fear gnawed at her. The boardroom was vast, high-ceilinged, walls lined with glowing screens, displaying schematics of engines and streams of data, and at the long polished table sat a row of executives in dark suits, their eyes sharp, their expressions honed from years of cutting down proposals with a glance, and as Richard led Naomi to stand at his side, whispers rippled instantly. The man at the head, his hair silver and his glasses glinting, spoke with irritation. "Mr. Coleman, we have waited 6 hours for this meeting. I hope you have good reason." Richard's voice was calm but firm, carrying the authority of a man who never explained himself unless he chose to. "I do. I bring you Naomi Johnson, the engineer who restored my jet after your competitors failed." Murmurs spread, disbelief plain, and a woman in a red blazer arched an eyebrow, her voice laced with condescension. "That girl?" She let her eyes sweep Naomi from head to toe, pausing on the worn fabric of her clothes. "She looks untested." Heat rose in Naomi's cheeks, but she clasped her hands behind her back to steady them, forcing herself to meet the woman's gaze with steady eyes. Yet her silence only deepened the scorn in the room. Richard's voice sharpened, slicing through the disdain. "Do not judge by what you see. Judge by what she can do." The silver-haired man leaned forward, fingers steepled, his voice cold. "Very well, Miss Johnson. Mr. Coleman speaks highly of you, but skill in a hangar in Atlanta is not the same as skill at the international level. Tell us, what exactly did you fix on his jet?" Naomi's breath caught, but she forced herself to exhale slowly, drawing from the calm she felt when listening to machines, and her voice came clear, though her chest tightened. The compressor clamp had been secured on the wrong groove, creating a leak that whistled under load. At the same time, a sensor wire's insulation had cracked and rubbed against a bracket, feeding false readings when it heated. Either fault was hard to find, but together they masked each other. That is why his team failed. The whistle was not the core, the rough spool was not damage. Fixing both gave truth back to the engine. The room fell silent, some executives frowning, others narrowing their eyes, and then an older woman with silver hair pulled into a bun tilted her head. "Impressed despite herself?" "That is correct." The man in glasses frowned, his pride pricked. "Anyone can memorize a manual." Richard's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Naomi raised her hand slightly. Her voice quiet but steady. "May I?" The woman in red gestured toward the screen with a smirk. "Go ahead." Naomi walked to the glowing display where a digital schematic of a jet engine rotated slowly, her fingers hovering over the controls, and she said, "Give me a failure scenario." The man in glasses smirked, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "Very well." Numbers scrambled across the screen, a red warning light flashing beside the virtual engine. Naomi's eyes narrowed as she scanned the data, her lips moving silently. Then she spoke. "This is not turbine or fuel. It is a vibration sensor giving false high readings, either loose mounting or calibration offset. The vibration pattern does not match physical stress, which means this is software echo. Recalibration resolves it." Her hands moved quickly, isolating the readings, tapping keys, and the red warning vanished, the system confirming her conclusion. She turned back to the table, her voice calm. "If this were real, I would check the mounting first, but the engine itself is fine." The silver-haired woman spoke first, her tone decisive. "She is right. Perfectly right." The man in glasses leaned back, his face pale, his smirk gone, and Richard allowed himself the faintest smile before speaking. "Now, do you see?" The woman in red crossed her arms, her lips thin. "We cannot deny her brilliance. But brilliance is not enough. Leading a branch requires discipline, leadership, resilience." Richard rose to his full height, his voice filling the boardroom. "She has all three. She survived tragedy that would have broken others. She endured 2 years of homelessness and still carried her knowledge like a torch. If that is not resilience, then what is?" The woman in the bun nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "Perhaps it is time we stop underestimating women like her." She turned directly to Naomi, her voice deliberate. "If we gave you Atlanta, our largest branch in the South, what would you do?" Naomi's heart pounded, her throat dry, but she forced herself to meet the woman's eyes, her voice trembling at first but strengthening with each word. "I would make it the most profitable branch in the world. Not for pride, but to prove that no tragedy, no circumstance, can bury true potential." For a long moment silence reigned, then the man in glasses sighed heavily, setting down his pen. "Let her try. I cannot deny what I have seen." The woman in red pursed her lips, giving a reluctant nod, while the silver-haired woman smiled faintly. "Welcome to Aerotech, Naomi Johnson. From this day forward, Atlanta is yours." Naomi's vision blurred with tears, her knees nearly giving way, and she bowed her head, whispering, "Thank you." Richard placed his hand gently on her shoulder, his voice warm. "You have earned this." But even as they left the boardroom, Richard's phone buzzed, his eyes darkening as he read the message, and Naomi, noticing his expression shift, whispered, "Is something wrong?" Richard's lips tightened, his tone grave. "It seems not everyone is pleased. There may be opposition waiting in Atlanta." Naomi's stomach dropped, the joy of victory colliding with the shadow of new conflict. And as the elevator doors closed around them, she realized the hardest tests were still to come. The flight back to Atlanta carried with it a different weight than the one that had lifted Naomi from despair only days earlier, for now she returned not as an invisible woman in rags, but as the newly appointed head of Aerotech's most critical branch, a title that carried both honor and danger. And as the jet descended toward the runway, she sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind torn between the echoes of applause in the New York boardroom and the warning Richard had given her in the elevator, the reminder that not everyone wanted her success. The moment she stepped off the plane and into the humid Georgia air, flashes exploded as reporters crowded the tarmac, cameras clicking, microphones thrust forward, their voices calling her name. The story of the homeless black woman who had saved a billionaire's jet spreading faster than she could comprehend, and Richard shielded her with his arm as security formed a wall around them, guiding her toward the waiting cars. And though she felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, she held her head high, determined not to let fear undo what she had gained. Inside the newly renovated Aerotech Atlanta hangar, the air buzzed with a different kind of energy. Mechanics and staff lined up for introductions, their expressions mixed, some curious, some respectful, others skeptical. And at the front stood Charles Miller, the regional director whose stiff handshake carried more disdain than welcome, his words dripping with doubt. "So, you are the young woman from the papers. I must admit, I find it difficult to believe that someone with no experience running an operation of this size has been given such responsibility." Naomi met his eyes, her voice quiet but steady. "Judge me not by where I have been, but by what I can do." Murmurs rippled through the staff, some nodding, others crossing their arms, and Charles's lips tightened into a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. For the next week, Naomi immersed herself in the rhythms of the branch, walking the hangar floors, listening to mechanics, learning the flow of schedules, shipments, and contracts, her presence both commanding and humble, for she did not bark orders but asked questions, showing men twice her age that she valued their insight, and slowly respect began to grow, though skepticism lingered like a shadow. Then came the call that would test everything. A Gulfstream jet belonging to a high-profile client reported severe engine trouble just before an international departure, and panic rippled instantly through the branch, for failure would not only damage Aerotech's reputation, but also destroy Naomi's credibility before it had time to take root. Charles folded his arms, his tone smug. "Let's see what the miracle girl can do." Naomi swallowed her fear, straightened her shoulders, and said firmly, "Bring the aircraft in." The jet was towed into the hangar, its sleek frame gleaming under the lights, but the air inside was thick with doubt as mechanics whispered, some predicting disaster, others silently hoping she would succeed. Naomi walked around the engine slowly, her fingers brushing the metal as though feeling for its heartbeat, her mind sifting through every memory of classrooms, textbooks, and the countless hours she had once spent listening to the voices of machines. And after minutes of silence she spoke, her words carrying certainty. "This is not a fuel problem, it is a faulty bleed valve. It sticks open under load, bleeding away the air the compressor needs. That is why it stalls." Mark Stevens, now humbled after Atlanta, stepped forward, his voice respectful. "She's right. I saw the signs too, but she explained it before I could." The staff looked between them, the disbelief in their eyes faltering. replaced by a flicker of recognition that this woman might truly see what they could not. Charles scowled, his pride pricked. Then fix it. But understand, if you fail, this branch fails with you. Naomi nodded once, her fear burning into determination, and she moved swiftly, directing the team, assigning tasks with clarity and confidence, teaching as she worked, showing them not only what to do but why, her knowledge flowing like a map across the labyrinth of wires and valves. Hours passed, sweat soaking her clothes, but Naomi never faltered, and when the final adjustments were made, she stepped back, giving the order to test. The engine roared, hesitated, then surged smoothly into perfect rhythm, its hum filling the hangar like a declaration, and the client, stunned, shook her hand personally, praising her brilliance and promising to spread the story of her skill. For the first time, the staff erupted in cheers for Naomi, clapping and shouting her name, their doubt cracking under the weight of proof, and she stood among them with tears stinging her eyes, humbled and grateful. Yet even as the cheers filled the hangar, Naomi's gaze found Charles standing in the corner, his arms still crossed, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with resentment. And in that moment she understood that some hearts would never yield willingly, and that his pride, now wounded, would not retreat quietly, but plot in silence. That evening Naomi sat alone in her small office, the cheers still echoing faintly outside, but her heart heavy with unease, her success already shadowed by the knowledge that not everyone wanted her victory. And when the door opened, Richard entered, his face warm with pride. "You have done more in a week than many do in years. Atlanta is alive under your leadership." Naomi smiled faintly, her voice low. "But not everyone believes in me." Richard sighed, leaning against the desk, his tone firm. "Envy is louder than applause. But trust me, you have planted something here no enemy can uproot." Naomi nodded, his words a balm to her restless heart. But before she could respond, another knock came at the door. And when it opened, Richard's son Daniel stepped inside, his tall frame filling the doorway, his gentle smile reaching his eyes as they lingered on Naomi with quiet intensity. And in that single moment the air shifted, a new chapter beginning even as the last one remained unfinished. Daniel Coleman's arrival at the Atlanta branch felt almost ordinary at first, a son returning from New York after completing his MBA, ready to take his role as company accountant. Yet the moment his eyes fell on Naomi Johnson in the office where she sat reviewing contracts late into the night, something sparked that neither of them could ignore, a quiet recognition born not of words but of presence. And though the hangar outside still buzzed with doubts and whispers about a homeless black woman elevated to leadership, inside that small office there was no pretense. Only a man seeing a woman who carried herself with the strength of survival, and a woman seeing a man who looked at her without pity. Their first conversations were cautious, framed by business, Daniel offering assistance on balancing figures, Naomi explaining the technical details of the operations she was now responsible for. But with each passing evening their exchanges stretched longer, spilling into talks of childhood, of dreams, of what it meant to lose and what it meant to rebuild. And soon the mechanics began to notice the way Daniel lingered near her, the way his eyes softened when she spoke, the way her laughter, rare and fragile, came easier in his presence. Rumors spread quickly, some whispered with curiosity, others with scorn, for in the South, though progress had been made, the sight of a wealthy white man's son standing so close to a black woman who had once begged on the streets stirred prejudices that had not yet died, and Charles Miller, already bitter from being forced to watch Naomi succeed, seized on the whispers, muttering to his allies that her rise was not talent but manipulation, that she ensnared the billionaire's son to protect her position, fueling a poison he hoped would undermine her authority. Naomi, aware of the stares and the gossip, tried at first to distance herself, keeping conversations with Daniel clipped and professional, yet the honesty of his presence wore down her defenses, for he did not look at her as the engineers once had, as a beggar pretending, but as a woman who had endured and emerged stronger. And one evening on the balcony of Richard's mansion, overlooking the glittering Atlanta skyline, she finally allowed herself to breathe in his closeness without fear. The city stretched before them, headlights weaving through the streets like rivers of light, the hum of life below, blending with the quiet between them. And Daniel turned to her, his heart pounding, his voice low but unwavering. "Naomi, you came into our lives like a storm, You fixed what others could not fix, not just engines but hope, and I do not want to imagine a life without you." He knelt down then, his hand trembling only slightly as he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, the diamond within catching the city's glow, and he asked with sincerity that silenced every doubt she had carried, "Will you marry me?" Naomi's breath caught, her vision blurring as tears spilled freely, and for a moment all the pain of her past surged back, the nights of hunger, the cruel laughter, the loneliness. But then, like the engine she had brought back to life, her heart steadied, and she whispered through trembling lips, "Yes." Their wedding months later was unlike any Atlanta had seen, a cathedral glittering with flowers and chandeliers, the pews filled with the elite of Georgia, reporters swarming the steps, cameras flashing as the world sought to capture the story of the homeless black woman who had risen not only to lead Aerotech's largest branch, but to stand at the altar with the son of one of America's most powerful businessmen. Richard himself walked Naomi down the aisle, his hand firm on hers, his eyes glistening with tears, and as they moved toward Daniel waiting at the altar, he whispered, "You were once a girl in rags who fixed my jet. Now you are my daughter." The words nearly broke her, but she steadied herself, standing before Daniel as the cathedral rose in reverence, and she spoke her vows with a voice that carried the strength of survival and the humility of gratitude. "I lost myself in tragedy. I walked the streets invisible. I begged for scraps. But one day I dared to say, 'If you permit, I will fix it,' and that moment changed my life. Today I am not only the head of Atlanta's largest jet maintenance branch, but I am your wife, and I vow never to waste this chance life has given me again." Applause erupted, the cathedral filled with cheers, Richard weeping openly as he raised his hands in gratitude, and Naomi, radiant in her gown, felt for the first time that her journey through darkness had led her not to mere survival, but to a life filled with love, dignity, and belonging. The years that followed Naomi's marriage to Daniel Coleman brought not only the warmth of family but also the weight of responsibility, for while she cradled her son Jonathan in her arms and felt the kind of joy that had once seemed forever lost to her, the demands of leading Aerotech's Atlanta branch never relented, and every day presented fresh challenges that tested her not just as an engineer, but as a leader, a wife, a mother, and a woman who carried the burden of being a symbol to those who had been told their skin or their past made them less. In the hangar where she had once stood in rags and defied ridicule, Naomi now walked with the confidence of authority, her voice directing teams, her eyes scanning schematics, her mind finding solutions where others saw only problems, and the very men who had laughed at her once now looked to her for guidance, their respect earned not by commands but by the proof of her consistency, for she led with a blend of humility and precision that made even the proudest technician fall silent in her presence. Charles Miller, who had once scowled in corners and whispered against her, eventually fell to the weight of his own bitterness, his schemes exposed when Naomi discovered falsified reports meant to sabotage her credibility, and though she could have destroyed him publicly, she chose instead to confront him privately, her voice steady but firm as she told him, "I do not need to ruin you to prove myself. Your actions have already done that. What I will do is continue to rise, and you will have to live with the truth that you tried to bury me and failed." The mercy in her decision stung him more than punishment would have, and in time his name faded while hers rose higher, her leadership securing contracts that made Atlanta Aerotech's most profitable branch in the world. Yet even as her professional triumphs multiplied, what made Naomi's story spread far beyond Atlanta was not her brilliance with machines, but the way she embodied something larger, a truth that cut across race, wealth, and circumstance. For she never forgot where she had come from, and when reporters asked her how she had survived the streets and still found her way back to her destiny, she would answer simply, "Because I never let the fire inside me die, and because someone chose to see me for what I could do instead of what I looked like." Richard Coleman, older now, would watch her with quiet pride, his once sharp voice softened by years and by the presence of his grandson, and he would tell friends and business partners that Naomi had taught him more about greatness than any boardroom ever had, reminding them all that money and power mean little without compassion. And when he passed, it was Naomi who stood beside Daniel at the funeral, holding Jonathan's hand, her tears falling not only for the man who had given her a second chance, but for the father who had claimed her as his own. Her story became legend, told in classrooms, written in newspapers, spoken in boardrooms, the tale of the homeless black woman who fixed what the experts could not, who endured tragedy and prejudice, who found love across boundaries and built a legacy that reshaped what people believed possible. And for those still trapped in despair, her life was proof that the worst day could be the beginning of something new if only one dared to say, "If you permit, I will fix it." Years later, standing on a stage at a graduation ceremony where she was invited as keynote speaker, Naomi looked out at rows of young faces, some bright with privilege, others shadowed with the same hunger she once knew, and she told them her truth with a voice strong and clear. "The world will try to measure you by what it sees: your clothes, your skin, your past, but engines do not care about appearances, only about truth, and neither should you. Do not let anyone convince you that your mistakes or your pain disqualify you from greatness. If you carry skill, if you carry heart, then you carry the power to change not only your own life, but the lives of those around you. I was invisible once, but now I stand before you not because of charity, but because I dared to act when others stood silent. So when the moment comes for you, do not let fear steal it. Say the words, take the step, and fix what others cannot." The auditorium erupted in applause, students rising to their feet, tears shining in the eyes of many who saw themselves reflected in her story. And Naomi stood there, her head high, her heart full, knowing that the tragedy that had once crushed her had been transformed into a foundation strong enough to carry others. When she returned home that night, Jonathan ran into her arms, Daniel smiling proudly as he watched them. And as Naomi held her son, she whispered softly into his ear, "You will grow up in a world where your worth will not be questioned by rags or riches, but by the truth you carry in your heart. And I will make sure you know that." She looked at Daniel, their eyes meeting with a love that had been forged in defiance of prejudice, and together they stood in the quiet of their home, a family bound not by convenience, but by the choices each of them had made to stand firm in the face of doubt. Outside, the city lights shimmered like constellations, and Naomi thought of the night she had stood in that hangar, her gown torn, her body weak, her voice daring to ask for permission. And she realized that what had changed her life was not only that she had been allowed to act, but that she had refused to let despair silence her, and in that truth lay the meaning she carried into every word she spoke, every hand she held, every life she touched. The end of her journey was not a mansion, nor titles, nor applause, but the knowledge that she had proven once and for all that dignity, resilience, and love could cross every boundary, and that when people chose compassion over pride, they could change not just one life but the world. The end. If Naomi Johnson's journey from the streets to leadership and love moved you, let us know by sharing your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from and what part of her story struck you the most. Was it the moment she silenced the laughter in the hangar, the scene where she stood before the executives in New York, or when she finally walked down the aisle with Daniel? Your perspective matters. If you want to hear more stories that remind us of resilience, dignity, and second chances, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for the next story.